Nice suit, Gavin. Who paid? That was the first thing Donald Trump threw across the room after walking into a Senate hearing where nobody had scheduled him, nobody had invited him, and apparently nobody had prepared for what would happen once he sat down. Secret Service came through first, then Trump followed, taking his place at the dais with the confidence of a man who did not need permission to become the center of attention, while Gavin Newsom sat across from him looking exactly as his political team had intended. Immaculate suit, controlled posture, camera-ready hair, every visible detail polished for television. 15 minutes earlier, Newsom had entered the room carrying the unmistakable atmosphere of a politician already imagining the campaign advertisement that would come out of the hearing, his team preparing social media lines about California leading while Washington followed, his opening attack describing Trump as the greatest threat to American democracy since the Civil War. Then, Trump looked at the suit, looked at the hair, looked back at Newsom, and reduced the carefully manufactured atmosphere to one question about who had paid for what Newsom was wearing. The room did not immediately laugh, but it produced that unmistakable sound that comes immediately before laughter. The sound of an audience realizing that the scripted event it expected had just been replaced by something much less controlled. Trump kept going without rushing, praising the suit just enough to make the praise sound like an accusation, asking whether it was Brioni, reminding the room that he knew clothing, then pointing out that the outfit probably cost more than many Californians paid in rent. He did not stay on rent yet, because the point was not simply the suit. The point was the contrast, the visual image of a governor presenting himself as the polished face of progressive competence while standing over a state where housing costs, homelessness, business flight, and public disorder had become permanent political liabilities. Then came the nickname, delivered with the deliberate timing. Trump had turned into a political weapon long before Newsom entered statewide office. French Laundry Gavin. The reference required almost no explanation because the image had already been burned into the political memory surrounding Newsom, a governor photographed at an elite Napa Valley restaurant during the same period when ordinary Californians were being told to stay home, avoid gatherings, shut businesses, and rearrange their lives around emergency restrictions. Trump let the name sit in the room because he understood that a nickname is most damaging when it compresses an entire accusation into 3 words that opponents are forced to hear repeatedly. Then he produced his phone, set it on the desk, and announced that he had brought pictures, lots of them, and that the images represented roughly $20 billion in homelessness spending that had failed to produce the results Californians had been promised. The first photograph appeared on the hearing room display, a San Francisco street crowded with tents, tarps, shopping carts, scattered belongings, and people lying on sidewalks in broad daylight, the kind of image that was impossible to reconcile with the carefully marketed idea of California as the unquestioned model of modern American governance. Trump reminded the room that this was not a war zone and not a developing country, but a city inside one of the largest economies on the planet, a place with extraordinary wealth sitting beside scenes of public collapse that had become familiar enough to lose their ability to shock local officials. He swiped to another image showing discarded needles near a playground, then another contrasting Venice Beach before and after the growth of encampments, using the pictures to sharpen the same accusation. Billions had been spent, yet the visible disorder had not disappeared. The criticism was brutally simple because it did not depend on a complicated ideological argument. If government announces massive spending to solve a problem, and the public sees the problem becoming more visible, the people responsible eventually have to explain what the money actually accomplished. Trump attacked the contradiction directly, arguing that spending $20 billion while homelessness continued rising required a special category of incompetence because the state was not merely failing to improve fast enough, it was pouring historic amounts of money into programs while ordinary residents continued watching tents multiply around them. Then he widened the attack beyond homelessness and into the California exodus, naming Tesla, Oracle, Hewlett-Packard, Joe Rogan, and other high-profile departures as symbols of people and companies choosing to build lives somewhere else rather than continue absorbing California's regulatory costs and political priorities. A construction company owner identified as Mike Driscoll stood from the gallery and described leaving Riverside County after 16 years, taking his company and 23 employees to Boise because California permitting, regulations, taxes, and construction expenses had made affordable starter homes increasingly unrealistic. Driscoll's point landed harder than another politician's talking point because he described the decision from the perspective of someone who had actually tried to build houses, pay workers, keep prices within reach, and remain in the state until the numbers no longer worked. Trump immediately seized on it, hammering the contradiction between politicians promising more affordable housing and the same political structure making it increasingly difficult for builders to produce that housing at an affordable price. Then the screen changed again, and the hearing moved from California's streets to November 2020, where two images created the contrast Trump had been waiting to exploit. On one side was Newsom's public message urging Californians to stay home and save lives, the familiar pandemic-era posture of solemn responsibility, masks, restrictions, canceled gatherings, closed businesses, and government officials insisting that sacrifice was necessary because everyone was supposedly living under the same emergency rules. On the other side was the French Laundry photograph from that same period. Newsom sitting at an expensive dinner with lobbyists, maskless, surrounded by wine glasses, and the unmistakable atmosphere of people who were not experiencing the lockdown in anything resembling the same way as restaurant owners, employees, parents, and families across the state. Trump did not need to manufacture the hypocrisy because the visual contrast did the work for him. One message for millions of citizens, another reality for the governor and the people seated around his table. Monday was stay home, save lives. And by Friday, the image was a $350 a plate dinner. And that contradiction became the centerpiece of Trump's argument that Newsom's leadership was built around rules that became negotiable the moment they reached the people writing them. Newsom finally pushed back, pointing to California's enormous economy and its strength in technology, biotechnology, entertainment, renewable energy, and job creation, accusing Trump of showing isolated photographs and pretending they represented nearly 40 million people. Trump rejected the defense immediately, saying he had photographs from the Tenderloin, Skid Row, Venice Beach, and other neighborhoods, turning Newsom's objection into another opportunity to argue that California's economic strength existed despite the governor rather than because of him. Silicon Valley had not been created by Gavin Newsom. Hollywood had not been created by Gavin Newsom. And the innovators, entrepreneurs, studios, engineers, builders, and companies responsible for California's global position had spent decades creating value long before Newsom could claim political credit for inheriting it. That distinction was central to Trump's attack because a politician taking credit for the size of an inherited economy is much easier to challenge when residents can simultaneously see businesses leaving, housing becoming unaffordable, homelessness spreading, and public systems consuming billions without producing corresponding improvements. By this point, French Laundry Gavin was no longer merely a joke about an expensive restaurant. It had become Trump's shorthand for the entire accusation that Newsom's California looked impressive from a distance, sounded impressive during a press conference, and became far less impressive the moment anyone started examining what ordinary people were being asked to tolerate. Trump then returned to November 6, 2020, stripping away the humor and focusing directly on the moment when COVID restrictions were dominating everyday life, hospitals were under enormous pressure, businesses were closed, schools were disrupted, and Californians were repeatedly instructed not to gather with family. Newsom had appeared publicly urging people to stay home, follow the science, wear masks, and accept restrictions presented as necessary for the common good, yet the French Laundry images showed him at a dinner with roughly a dozen people, including politically connected figures, creating the exact visual contradiction opponents needed. Trump displayed the photograph again and forced the room to sit with it, emphasizing Newsom laughing at the table while businesses only miles away were struggling to keep employees paid, lights on, rent covered, and years of work from disappearing under emergency orders they had no power to change. The argument was no longer merely that Newsom had made a bad political decision. Trump was framing it as a hierarchy in which the people enforcing sacrifice enjoyed exceptions unavailable to the people absorbing the economic pain. And when a woman named Rosa Callahan rose from the gallery to describe closing her restaurant for 7 months, only 3 miles from the French Laundry, losing savings, laying off 11 employees, and watching her marriage collapse under the pressure, the distance between Newsom's dinner and everyone else's lockdown suddenly became measurable in exactly the terms Trump wanted. 3 miles, $350, and 2 completely different versions of California. Rosa Callahan's testimony did something the photographs alone could not do, because it converted the French Laundry controversy from an abstract political scandal into a direct comparison between 2 Californians living under the same government but experiencing completely different consequences. She had been 3 miles away from the governor, operating under the same emergency orders, but while Newsom sat with lobbyists at a dinner that symbolized access, insulation, and privilege, she was closing a business, draining savings, laying off employees she had known for years, and watching the pressure seep into every part of her private life. Trump did not interrupt her because there was nothing to improve, nothing to exaggerate, and nothing useful to add when the contrast already carried its own indictment. Once she sat down, the room was quiet, in a way that political rooms rarely become quiet, because everyone understood that arguments about policy become much harder to sanitize when one person can stand up and describe exactly what those policies cost her. Then Trump moved to the next number, and the number was large enough to make even the French Laundry dinner look like a minor symbol inside a much broader argument about administrative failure. $33 billion in unemployment payments, Trump said, money that California's Employment Development Department had sent into fraudulent claims, false identities, prisoner accounts, stolen Social Security numbers, and other schemes during the pandemic. He mocked the absurdity of losing a sum that large as though it were a set of misplaced car keys, because $33 billion was not an accounting error hidden inside a spreadsheet, but the kind of number that would destroy private companies, trigger prosecutions, end careers, and consume years of explanation if it vanished under the watch of a corporate executive. The central question was brutally uncomplicated. Where was Gavin Newsom while the system was bleeding money on that scale, and what exactly had his administration done to prevent it before the losses became impossible to ignore? Trump leaned into the question rather than burying it beneath policy jargon, asking whether Newsom had been in Sacramento, whether he had been confronting the agency, whether he had been demanding accountability, or whether he had been occupied with the very image that had already come to define his pandemic hypocrisy. He did not need Newsom to answer, because by this point the structure of the attack was obvious. Homelessness spending with worsening homelessness, pandemic restrictions accompanied by elite exemptions, and billions in fraud under an administration that still marketed itself as a national model. Then Trump changed direction, and the room changed with him, because the attack moved from public policy into something much more personal and much more dangerous. He acknowledged his own history before Newsom could use it as a shield, openly admitting that his personal life had been dragged through tabloids, investigations, scandals, accusations, and public humiliation for decades, which allowed him to frame what came next, not as moral preaching, but as a question of loyalty. Trump said loyalty mattered to him more than almost anything, not blind obedience and not permanent agreement, but the basic idea that trust between people should mean something when careers, friendships, marriages, and political futures are on the line. Then he said the name Alex Turk, Newsom's longtime friend and campaign manager, the man who had worked to build Newsom's political career, raised money, organized campaigns, defended him, and helped turn ambition into actual power. Trump's accusation was blunt because the underlying story needed no decorative language. While Turk was helping Gavin Newsom build his career, Newsom had an affair with Turk's wife, Ruby Rippy Turk, who worked in Newsom's office. The attack was devastating, not because political audiences are unfamiliar with adultery, but because Trump framed the affair as a betrayal committed against someone who had been personally loyal to Newsom at the moment Newsom needed him most. Turk had not been some distant acquaintance standing at a fundraiser. He had been part of the machinery that carried Newsom upward, and once the affair became public, the damage was not limited to a marriage or a headline, but reached directly into the image of trustworthiness Newsom had spent years cultivating. Trump reminded the room that Newsom publicly apologized, described himself as deeply sorry, and connected the episode to alcohol, creating the impression that treatment and personal reform would follow. Then he drove into the detail he considered most revealing, Newsom's later acknowledgement that he had not actually entered a formal rehabilitation program, that there had been no treatment structure matching the public impression created at the time, and that he had simply stopped drinking. To Trump, that distinction was not a technicality, but the entire pattern compressed into one personal episode. Public damage occurs. A polished statement appears. Accountability is announced. Cameras move on. And the substance underneath the announcement turns out to be thinner than the presentation. Trump turned even that into ridicule, joking that California politics apparently treated betraying a campaign manager as though it belonged on a professional resume beside policy development and public speaking. But the joke only worked because the accusation had already landed. Newsom finally came back hard, and this time he abandoned some of the smoothness that had defined his earlier responses, striking directly at Trump's own history rather than defending the details Trump had raised. He brought up Trump's bankruptcies, Trump University and its fraud settlement, the Trump Foundation and the legal action that shut it down, and Trump's criminal convictions, challenging the president to compare records rather than pretend that one side alone carried baggage. For the first time in the hearing, the Democratic side of the room erupted with real momentum, standing, applauding, filming, and reacting as though the entire event had finally shifted back into Newsom's control. The point was effective precisely because Newsom had stopped trying to defend California and had instead forced Trump to stand inside his own record, where the bankruptcies, settlements, foundation case, and convictions gave Newsom something concrete to hit. For roughly 20 seconds, the room belonged to Gavin Newsom, and unlike the earlier applause, this was not ceremonial noise, but the kind of political reaction that tells a communications team a usable clip has finally arrived. Trump did not talk over it, did not immediately reach for another insult, and did not try to drown the applause with volume. He sat through it and waited until the room had spent its energy. When the noise finally dropped, he started with the 6 bankruptcies, not denying them, not qualifying them away, but saying Newsom was right and then converting the admission into a defense of recovery, risk, failure, and rebuilding. Trump's argument was that builders fail, lose money, fight banks, markets, lawyers, and bad deals. Then return to work because failure itself does not determine the final result unless it becomes permanent. He contrasted that with California's problems under Newsom, saying that when homelessness rose, businesses left, and billions disappeared, Newsom's instinct was not to rebuild, but to preside over press conferences while the same failures continued beneath the language. That was the line Trump wanted the room to remember. When things go wrong, he builds, and when things go wrong for Gavin Newsom, Gavin eats. It was crude, compressed, and politically efficient because it pulled the entire French Laundry image back into the argument while answering Newsom's strongest attack without pretending Trump's own failures had never happened. Trump moved to the foundation next, again conceding the penalty rather than wasting time denying the record, saying he paid, moved on, and continued, while contrasting that approach with Newsom's handling of the affair and the alcohol explanation. Then he sharpened the personal comparison further, saying Newsom's later admission that there had been no rehab turned the original apology into something that looked less like accountability and more like a professionally managed press release. The polished governor had finally landed a clean shot, but Trump had absorbed it, turned the impact into another attack on Newsom's defining weakness, and the momentum that had briefly belonged to the Democratic gallery started draining out of the room almost as quickly as it had arrived. Then the smile returned, and the hearing shifted again because Trump announced that he had been saving his favorite part, something involving Newsom's first wife, Kimberly Guilfoyle. He reminded the room that Guilfoyle had once been married to Newsom, then later joined Trump's political orbit, and became one of his most visible allies. A fact Trump presented with the satisfaction of someone discovering that his opponent's biography contained a punchline nobody else in the room would dare use. Trump said he had once asked her what it had been like to be married to Gavin, then paused long enough for every camera to settle, every reporter to prepare, and every person in the room to understand that the answer mattered less than the performance surrounding it. According to Trump's version, Kimberly did not answer with a speech, an accusation, or a detailed story. She simply smiled. Trump then claimed that the smile told him everything he needed to know, turning one silent reaction into a weapon against Newsom's leadership, character, and carefully constructed public persona. Newsom opened his mouth and stopped, tried again and stopped again, and for the first time during the hearing, the man who had spent decades mastering controlled responses could not immediately locate the sentence he needed. Then came the small gesture that Trump's attack had been driving toward without anyone in the room realizing it. Newsom lifted his hand and touched his hair. It was nothing in ordinary human terms, just a brief, involuntary movement, but on a politician whose entire image depended on visual control, perfect grooming, measured posture, and the absence of visible uncertainty, the gesture suddenly looked much larger than it physically was. Reporters noticed it, cameras captured it, and the room interpreted it as the first unmistakable sign that Newsom's composure had cracked beneath the accumulated pressure of the homelessness images, French Laundry, fraud losses, the affair, Trump's comeback, and now his ex-wife's silent smile. Trump had not yet delivered the closing argument, but by that moment he had already assembled every piece he intended to use, and the next phase would be about connecting those pieces into one accusation about what Gavin Newsom's entire political career supposedly represented. Trump stood, buttoned his jacket, and moved into the closing argument he had been building toward since the moment he walked into the room and looked at Newsom's suit. French Laundry was no longer merely a nickname tied to one dinner, because Trump now treated it as a diagnosis of Newsom's entire political identity. Polished exterior, expensive presentation, endless confidence, and results that became harder to defend the closer anyone looked. He called Newsom a beautiful disaster, a politician who looked like a governor, looked like a presidential candidate, sounded smooth behind a microphone, and carried himself as though California itself were proof of his competence. Then Trump stripped that image apart, piece by piece, saying that underneath the hair there were no ideas, underneath the suit there was no backbone, underneath the smile there was no honesty, and underneath the carefully prepared language there were no results strong enough to justify the performance. The metaphor was deliberate and merciless. Newsom was a model home with no plumbing, a beautiful building with no foundation, something designed to impress from the street until somebody opened the door and discovered how little actually worked inside. Trump picked up his phone again and said he wanted to add everything together because numbers, unlike political branding, eventually force even the best-looking politician to confront what government actually produced. He returned first to homelessness, repeating the roughly $20 billion figure and hammering the contradiction that California could spend staggering amounts of public money while the number of people living on streets and inside encampments continued climbing. Trump mocked the outcome as the political equivalent of hiring a personal trainer and becoming heavier, because spending only becomes an accomplishment if the spending produces something better than the condition that existed before the checks were written. In his framing, Newsom's administration had mastered the easiest part of government, announcing programs, appropriating money, commissioning studies, staging press conferences, and promising transformation, while repeatedly failing at the difficult part, demonstrating that ordinary people could actually see the promised improvement. $20 billion was not merely a budget figure in Trump's argument, it was the price tag attached to the gap between Newsom's public image and California's visible reality. Then Trump returned to the unemployment fraud and the $33 billion loss, treating the number as so enormous that any normal organization would regard it as an existential catastrophe rather than another bureaucratic scandal to be absorbed by the next news cycle. He argued that if a private businessman lost $33 billion through incompetence and fraud, nobody would praise his leadership style, admire his suit, or invite him onto television to explain his vision for the future. They would want to know where the money went and why nobody stopped it. California government, in Trump's presentation, had somehow converted failure into background noise, allowing astonishing losses to become just another item in a state budget large enough to hide almost anything from voters who were already overwhelmed by rent, taxes, crime, traffic, insurance, and the cost of simply staying. Trump kept returning to the same distinction because it was the spine of the entire takedown. In the private sector, outcomes eventually crush excuses, while in politics, a skilled communicator can survive for years by replacing outcomes with language. Newsom, Trump argued, had become one of the most advanced practitioners of that substitution, selling competence through presentation, while the balance sheet underneath the presentation told a far uglier story. Then came California high-speed rail, and Trump treated the project with almost theatrical disbelief because it offered everything he needed in one example: enormous ambition, enormous spending, enormous delay, and almost nothing the public could actually use. Voters had approved the project in 2008, with the expectation of a modern transportation system linking major California population centers, an infrastructure achievement that was supposed to symbolize the state's technological confidence and long-term vision. Instead, Trump said, 18 years had passed by 2026, costs had exploded beyond what voters had originally been sold, and not a single passenger had yet traveled between San Francisco and Los Angeles on the promised completed system. He contrasted that record with his own background in construction, ridiculing the idea that California could spend years pouring concrete and talking about the future while builders in the real world were expected to finish projects, open doors, collect rent, employ workers, and justify every dollar to investors. The mockery worked because Trump reduced the project from the language of infrastructure planning to the simplest possible question. After all the time and all the money, where was the finished thing people had been promised? Gas prices became the next piece of the argument, with Trump attacking California's high fuel costs while simultaneously pointing to the state's plan to phase out sales of new gasoline-powered vehicles in the following decade. He presented the combination as another example of government making daily life more expensive first, and then announcing that the expensive things citizens depended on would eventually be restricted anyway, a policy sequence that sounded especially detached to families whose transportation choices were governed by paychecks rather than ideological branding. Then he returned to the departures, naming Tesla, Oracle, Hewlett Packard, Charles Schwab, Palantir, and other companies or prominent figures associated with moving major operations away from California. Trump did not claim that every company had abandoned the state entirely. His point was political and symbolic, that companies with access to lawyers, accountants, relocation teams, capital, and national options had increasingly demonstrated that California was no longer automatically the place they believed they had to remain. When people and businesses, powerful enough to choose, begin choosing somewhere else, Trump argued, the governor cannot simply point at California's inherited size and declare victory forever. Then came migration, another number Trump used as an answer to Newsom's earlier claim that Californians had re-elected him and therefore validated his leadership. Trump focused on net outmigration and the hundreds of thousands of people who had packed cars, rented trucks, moved families, sold houses, changed schools, transferred jobs, and deliberately placed state lines between themselves and California. Those decisions mattered because no political consultant could manufacture them and no approval rating could erase them. Leaving a state required money, disruption, uncertainty, and enough dissatisfaction to convince people that starting over elsewhere was worth the trouble. Trump described those departures as voting with their feet, a phrase that allowed him to contrast an election result with the quieter but equally meaningful judgment made by people deciding where they wanted to live. Newsom could say the people of California had re-elected him, but Trump's answer was that many people who did not like what California had become were solving the problem in a more permanent way by no longer being Californians. He then turned to wildfires, lowering the humor and making the accusation more severe because fire prevention was no longer about political embarrassment, but about homes, livelihoods, and human lives. Trump accused Newsom of overstating the amount of wildfire prevention work completed under his administration, citing an investigation that found the publicly claimed acreage had been exaggerated by hundreds of percent compared with the actual work performed. The criticism fit perfectly into the theme Trump had already constructed: impressive numbers announced at a podium, confident language repeated through media coverage, and a much less impressive result when somebody later examined the underlying record. He invoked firefighters digging through destruction after catastrophic fires, using their work as the physical contrast to a governor appearing before cameras, saying the proper words, and returning to Sacramento once the press conference ended. Beautiful words, Trump argued, did not rebuild burned homes, clear dangerous fuel, recover bodies, or erase the consequences when government performance failed to match government promises. By now, Trump had connected every attack into one continuous conclusion: homelessness, unemployment fraud, high-speed rail, gas prices, business departures, migration, wildfire management, French Laundry, and the personal betrayals he had raised earlier were not separate scandals, but different versions of the same political weakness. In his framing, Newsom had inherited extraordinary advantages, including world-class universities, Silicon Valley, Hollywood, the Pacific Coast, agricultural wealth, major ports, tourism, energy, technology, entertainment, and one of the most naturally attractive places in the country, yet had still managed to preside over a growing list of problems that residents were paying more and more to endure. That was why Trump returned to the phrase beautiful disaster, because California itself remained beautiful enough to disguise political failure longer than almost any other state could survive it. Newsom, he argued, had mistaken California's natural advantages and inherited industries for evidence that his own management was succeeding, taking credit for the strength while demanding patience on the deterioration. And then Trump asked the question that cut beneath every statistic. What had Gavin Newsom actually built that existed because of Gavin Newsom? Trump waited, because the silence was useful, and then answered his own question by accusing Newsom of talking rather than building, holding press conferences rather than producing physical results people could touch, use, enter, drive across, or point to as evidence that government had made life materially better. He contrasted that with buildings, hotels, roads, structures, and construction itself, the world Trump had spent decades using as his preferred measure of whether someone had actually turned promises into something real. Newsom attempted one final defense, reminding the room that Californians had re-elected him by a historic margin, but Trump immediately answered that Californians were also leaving in historic numbers, once again forcing the argument away from political applause and back toward behavior. By then, Newsom's communications team had stopped treating the hearing like the launchpad they had expected. The pre-written social media triumph had evaporated, and the polished event that was supposed to showcase a national political future had become a sustained public attack on the record Newsom hoped to use as his qualification for higher office. The chairman finally moved toward adjournment with no grand resolution, no dramatic referral, and no formal conclusion capable of reversing what the cameras had already captured, while Newsom rose, straightened his jacket, and prepared to leave a room that no longer looked anything like the stage he had expected to control. Newsom walked toward the exit with the same measured posture he had carried into the room, but the difference was that the posture now looked defensive rather than presidential. An attempt to preserve the appearance of control after the hearing had spent more than an hour attacking everything beneath it. His jacket was no longer perfectly smooth, his communications director had stopped filming minutes earlier, and the social media material prepared to celebrate California's leadership had quietly disappeared because there was no version of the afternoon that could still be sold as the coronation his team had expected. The committee chairman finally brought the hearing to an end without referrals, investigations, or formal action, an institutional conclusion so restrained that it almost looked absurd after the political demolition that had just occurred in front of cameras. Democratic members filtered out individually, wearing the carefully controlled expressions politicians adopt when leaving a room where the outcome has become impossible to spin in real time, while Newsom's campaign staff had already moved into the hallway and begun reorganizing around damage instead of opportunity. Newsom paused briefly at the door, not because he had discovered a final response, but because leaving required him to maintain the image of the same polished politician who had entered, even after everyone watching understood that the hearing had forced that image through a political stress test it had not survived intact. Trump did not follow him, because Trump had never treated winning a room as a reason to leave it, and instead remained inside taking questions from reporters for another 12 minutes as cameras crowded around him. Asked whether the confrontation had been necessary, he reduced his defense to the claim that telling the truth was always necessary, whether the target enjoyed hearing it or not. Asked whether Newsom would still run for president, Trump said he hoped so, describing a presidential campaign by French Laundry Gavin as something he would welcome rather than fear, because the nickname, the dinner, the homelessness images, and the rest of the record were already loaded into the political weapon he had just demonstrated. When reporters challenged him about bringing Kimberly Guilfoyle into the hearing, Trump admitted that perhaps the comment had been personal and perhaps it had been a lot, but he immediately defended it on the ground that he believed it was true. That answer captured the entire method he had used throughout the hearing: concede the excess, refuse the apology, and then return to the accusation before anyone else could determine where the boundaries of the discussion should have been. Trump left through the main entrance rather than disappearing through a side corridor, signing autographs, shaking hands with Capitol Police officers, posing for photographs, and treating the building like an extension of the political stage he had just taken over. Online, the hearing was stripped into clips almost immediately, and French Laundry Gavin surged into the trending conversation alongside beautiful disaster and references to Newsom's former wife. Yet according to the script's account, the clip that traveled furthest was not the homelessness montage, the unemployment fraud figure, the affair, or even Trump's line about Kimberly Guilfoyle, but the brief moment when Newsom reached toward his hair after losing his immediate response. 7 seconds of body language became more politically useful than entire minutes of policy argument because audiences could interpret it instantly, replay it without context, turn it into memes, add music, and treat one involuntary gesture as evidence that a politician known for composure had momentarily lost it. The image spread because modern politics often rewards the shortest symbol rather than the longest explanation, and Newsom's carefully managed appearance made a tiny crack look enormous precisely because the public had been trained to expect no cracks at all. The script describes that 7-second clip reaching tens of millions of views within a day, transformed into memes, GIFs, edits, and even a novelty country song built around the idea that Newsom had finally reached for the one part of his presentation that had never failed him. Rosa Callahan, the restaurant owner whose story had cut through the political theater earlier, gave a local interview afterward and returned to the same brutal arithmetic she had used in the hearing: 3 miles between her restaurant and the French Laundry, and $350 representing the gulf between the dinner she could not imagine paying for and the business she could no longer afford to keep open. Mike Driscoll posted from Boise with his construction crew in front of a half-finished house, emphasizing that the same workers and similar materials could produce a dramatically less expensive home once the company was operating outside California's regulatory environment. Kimberly Guilfoyle, according to the source narrative, responded with nothing more complicated than a smiling emoji, which was immediately interpreted as an extension of the very silence Trump had weaponized inside the hearing. Every reaction pushed the same political storyline forward without requiring Newsom's opponents to add anything new, because the hearing had already supplied the nickname, the pictures, the personal history, the numbers, and the visual moment that social media could recycle for days. Then came the campaign consequence the script had been predicting from its opening lines, with Newsom's presidential exploratory operation suspending activity that evening under language about reassessing the political landscape. The phrase sounded professional, calm, and temporary, but inside the logic of the narrative, it meant exactly what Trump's attack had been designed to produce. The idea of Newsom as a national candidate had taken a hit severe enough that donors and staff no longer saw an obvious path forward. One anonymous Democratic donor was described as believing that the French Laundry controversy itself might have been survivable, while the hair touch clip was not, because campaigns can prepare arguments against policy attacks, but cannot easily erase a viral image that becomes shorthand for weakness. That judgment may have been brutally shallow, but politics is often brutally shallow, especially once campaigns move from policy documents to television clips where 7 seconds can outweigh 7 years of preparation. Newsom had entered the hearing counting on Polish as an asset, and he left with the very machinery of that Polish turned against him. Later that evening, Trump went to a construction site in Washington, a federal building being renovated several blocks from the White House, where steel beams, concrete forms, cranes, welders, ironworkers, and heavy equipment provided the final metaphor the script had been preparing from the beginning. He walked through in his suit, speaking with workers and watching the frame rise, treating physical construction as the ultimate contrast with the kind of politics he had just spent hours mocking. When a reporter asked why he had come there, Trump answered that leadership was not press conferences, hair gel, or expensive dinners, but building something that had not existed before, transforming dirt, steel, concrete, labor, and plans into a result people could physically see. He used the unfinished building as evidence of his favorite distinction, arguing that a builder can point to what exists at the end of the process, while politicians like Newsom point to announcements, spending figures, and promises that remain unfinished long after the cameras disappear. The attack had started with a suit and ended with steel, and every section in between had been organized around the same accusation that appearance becomes meaningless when the finished product does not work. Trump admitted again that the remark about Newsom's former wife might have gone too far, but then returned to the same defense that had carried him through the press conference. It was true, and truth, in his view, mattered more than political etiquette once he had decided somebody deserved the attack. He described his anger at Newsom not as ordinary political anger, but as builder's anger, the frustration of watching someone inherit extraordinary advantages and then waste them through bad decisions, weak execution, bureaucratic excess, and endless presentation. California, in Trump's closing formulation, had offered nearly everything a governor could ask for, from coastlines and mountains to wealth, innovation, entertainment, agriculture, universities, ports, technology, and generations of accumulated opportunity. That was what made Newsom's record so easy for Trump to frame as vandalism rather than simple failure. The argument was not that Newsom had been handed a hopeless problem, but that he had been handed something extraordinary and still managed to produce homelessness crises, business exits, unaffordable housing, fraud losses, unfinished infrastructure, wildfire controversies, and the political symbol of French laundry. The construction site behind Trump therefore became the final contrast between something visibly rising and the California he had spent the entire hearing describing as something visibly coming apart. And that was the conclusion Trump wanted attached permanently to Gavin Newsom. Perfect hair, perfect suit, perfect smile, perfect lines, but an increasingly imperfect record underneath every layer of presentation. The builder from Queens had turned the governor from San Francisco into a political metaphor, using photographs, spending figures, business departures, lockdown hypocrisy, personal betrayal, unfinished infrastructure, wildfire accusations, and one ex-wife's supposed smile to argue that leadership should be judged by what remains after the speech's end. In that framing, the French Laundry dinner mattered because it represented the distance between the people making rules and the people paying for them. Homelessness spending mattered because it exposed the difference between money spent and problems solved. And the construction site mattered because it supplied the opposite image. Workers producing something measurable, one beam at a time. Trump's accusation was ultimately less complicated than the hearing itself. That leadership is not the ability to look presidential while explaining failure, but the ability to leave behind results strong enough that nobody needs a speech explaining why they should count. French Laundry, Gavin, beautiful disaster, perfect on the outside and empty underneath, became the closing verdict of a script built around one relentless idea. When presentation and performance collide, the politician with the better hair does not necessarily survive the politician with the sharper hammer.